biographer's goal, like the psychoanalysts, is to expose the person behind the masks that even the most transparent individuals wear. And as in psychoanalysis, the biographer's background and personality come into significant play. From what social context does the biographer work? What's the biographer's relationship with the subject? How does that relationship affect the process of mask removal? Well, I met James Baldwin at a party in Istanbul in December of 1961. The party was given by a sister of Engin Cezar, a Turkish friend who had played Giovanni in an actor's studio in-house performance of Baldwin's script of Giovanni's Room. When I arrived at the party, I was invited to go into the kitchen to introduce myself to Jimmy. I did just that, and there, sitting on a high stool, finishing, as it turned out, the last words of the novel Another Country, was James Baldwin. "Who are you?" he asked. He asked it somewhat sternly. He could be very stern. So, "Who are you?" "I'm David," I said. "I like that name," he said. Well, he said it through that famous explosive Baldwin smile, and so began a long friendship. After the party, we spent hours at a bar getting to know each other. I fell in love that night in all but a sexual sense. I fell in love with Jimmy's wisdom, his charm, his willingness to listen to a 24-year-old white teacher at an American school for Turks in Istanbul who knew almost nothing about his work. Although at the time I obviously had no intention of becoming Baldwin's biographer, I had unwittingly taken the first step in that direction. Our night together was the beginning of a process of mutual unmasking that would in fact lead to Baldwin's suggestion that I work for him when I returned to the States to do graduate studies. I took up that offer in the fall of 1963 and spent the next 2 years sorting and filing his papers, doing correspondence, and sometimes traveling with him. During this time, I came to know his family, friends, lovers, and civil rights associates. There were many memorable moments for a young graduate student. Marlon Brando descending the staircase at Doris Duke's home, dressed in a tuxedo, but without shoes or socks. Miles Davis serving chitlins in wine sauce in the garden of his New York apartment. Driving Baldwin to meet Malcolm X on St. Nicholas Avenue. An off-season week in Cherry Grove on Fire Island with Jimmy while he wrote the title story for his short story collection, Going to Meet the Man. A correspondence with Michael James, William's grandson, who sent Baldwin a photograph of his Uncle Henry's 75th birthday portrait by John Singer Sargent, signed by both the painter and the author. But the idea of writing a Baldwin biography was still beyond me, to a great extent because of the wide gap between Baldwin's world and the one I came from. This, although Jimmy, by then I called him that, often introduced me with a wry smile as my Boswell. In the spring of 1966, exhausted from civil rights work, Jimmy decided to return to Istanbul. He asked me to go with him. since I had lived in the city and would be well suited to make living arrangements for us. In easily the most romantic letter I ever received from him, he suggested that he needed me, quote, in his arms, unquote, in Turkey. When I told him that I would not be comfortable working for him and at the same time being in his arms, he urged me to join him anyway. We left in the early spring for Istanbul by way of London and Paris. In London, he discussed making a film of another country with Joseph Losey, Ava Gardner, John Huston, Tennessee Williams, and Marlon Brando. After a revealing conversation with Charlie Chaplin on the set of Chaplin's last film, we flew to Paris, where we met up with writers James Jones and Richard Olney, and with Bernard Hassel, a former dancer at the Folies Bergère. Jimmy showed me his Paris, including the building in which the lover who became Giovanni in Giovanni's room had in fact kept him locked up several years earlier. We arrived in Istanbul by ship, and soon after, during a trip to the interior, we visited Troy, where Jimmy had always wanted to go, and we underwent a potentially scandalous and dangerous episode with a sadistic magician in a tiny Turkish village. An episode which served as a stunning illustration of a theme that I already recognized in Baldwin's life and work, that safety was the enemy of self-realization and the possibility of real love. Later, we moved to a house on a cliff overlooking the Bosphorus and were joined by a Baldwin lover, by Jimmy's brother David, and by a procession of visitors, including Marlon Brando on his way to Tahiti, and Alex Haley on his way to Africa to research roots. Most important to me was the extended visit of Buford Delaney. When Jimmy sent me to Paris to meet Buford and to bring him by car to Istanbul, I asked him to tell me something about the painter, as I had never met him. The unsatisfactory answer was, he's a cross between Brer Rabbit and St. Francis of Assisi. That's all you need to know for now. Just don't lose him. Jimmy had not told me that his old friend had long been pursued by voices that taunted him as a black faggot and other N-word based taunts. The voices had driven him to an attempted suicide, in fact, in 1961. What Jimmy meant by "don't lose him" became evident when Buford attempted to jump out of our speeding car, claiming people in a speeding car going in the opposite direction were threatening him. It became even more evident in a transit hotel dorm in Yugoslavia when I awoke in the night to find that Buford's bed was empty. I found him later in the town square arguing with his voices, now personified by a collection of Yugoslavian villagers. There was only one way to be sure I wouldn't lose him again. For the rest of that night and for several nights in Turkey after that is until Brer Rabbit became St. Francis again, I slept in Buford's bed with my arms around him, precisely the position Jimmy had offered me and I had refused. What I learned in bed with Buford was in effect to hear with him the voices that before then would have been examples to me of mere racial paranoia on Buford's part. In those nights, I was able to break away from a blind cultural perspective that had dominated even the "we shall overcome" liberal culture of which I was a self-satisfied member. But what did this experience have to do with finding Jimmy? Was his sending me to Paris to collect Buford Delaney, a man he admired more than any other, and charging me not to lose him? Was it based on earnest trust, or was it a test? Jimmy was a natural teacher, and the trip with Buford was somehow the high point of my introduction to Jimmy's school on racism and the inner damage it can inflict. After several weeks, we put Buford on a plane to Paris, where I would visit him several times, once with my wife Pam. Jimmy and his brother David and I settled into our Bosphorus house, where Jimmy would work on his novel, Tell Me How Long the Train's Been Gone, which he eventually finished and which he dedicated to David Baldwin, Engin Cezar, and me. In 1967, Jimmy returned to the States. Soon after, I married and left Istanbul to pursue an academic career in the States. I saw Jimmy from time to time in Amherst, where he taught regularly at the 5 colleges, and several times he visited my wife and me. He got to know our children. It was probably people asking me so often what Baldwin was really like that finally led me to the possibility of a Baldwin biography. I had all the advantages of the biographer, all that a biographer could wish for, having lived in the same house as my subject and having had access to his friends and family and his personal papers, all of which I eventually sorted and filed. But I was unwilling to be a publishing scoundrel. If I were to write a biography, it would have to be with Jimmy's permission and cooperation. In 1977, I asked him for a letter authorizing the biography, a letter he willingly gave me. Still, I hesitated. My former dissertation advisor, Leon Adele, the Henry James biographer, warned me that I might be too close to my subject to be objective, or that my WASP background might blind me to aspects of Baldwin's world. When I relayed Adele's warnings to Jimmy, he said he would not have authorized the biographer if he thought either concern was warranted in my case. Now the biographical project began in earnest. For part of 1982, I was a fellow at the Camargo Foundation in Cassis, France. An easy train ride from Saint-Paul-de-Vence, where Jimmy had lived for half of every year since Istanbul. During several meetings in Cassis and St. Paul, Jimmy gave me both formal, that is taped, and informal interviews. I had also already learned much about his earlier life from conversations we had had since the early 60s, and from the autobiographical aspects of such works as Notes of a Native Son, Nobody Knows My Name, The Fire Next Time, No Name in the Street, and The Devil Finds Work. In the 1982 interviews and these books, Jimmy spoke of influences on his early life. There was Orilla, or Bill Miller, a young teacher's assistant, introduced her star grade school pupil to theater and politics and taught him not to hate white people. In junior high, the Harlem Renaissance poet Countee Cullen encouraged him to write, to learn a little French, and to love black people. When Jimmy, in effect, ran away from home to Greenwich Village, Connie Williams, a Trinidadian who owned a cafe called the Calypso, gave the teenager a job as a dishwasher and eventually as a waiter and host. A village friend introduced him to Richard Wright, who would help him get the grant that would make possible the first trip to France. A former high school classmate provided the space in his living room for Jimmy to teach a de facto class on racism to white folks he had met at the Calypso. As an apprentice Pentecostal preacher in Harlem, Jimmy had preached the gospel of Jesus. Disillusioned by the negligible effect of that gospel on his world, Jimmy had left the church and now, beginning Greenwich Village, was preaching his own gospel. Jimmy's primary mentor in the Greenwich Village years was Buford Delaney. Buford took the 15-year-old through what Jimmy later called the unusual door, into a world in which the music of Bessie Smith and Marian Anderson were as sacred as the salvation songs of the church from which the boy was escaping. A world in which the painter could teach the future writer how to see the meaningful details of the reality that surrounded him. Jimmy left Buford and the village for Paris in 1948. Buford followed him there in 1953. I would meet many of the Greenwich Village people after Jimmy's death. Connie Williams and Bill Miller especially sat for several interviews and became good friends. I had met Jimmy's Paris associates in the 60s and 70s. The most important of these were Buford, of course, and Mary Painter, an American economist and expatriate whom Jimmy had told me he would have married if he could have married any woman. Jimmy and I continued to meet during the 80s. Late in 86, David Baldwin, by now a close friend and supporter of the biography, warned me by phone that I had better come to St. Paul as soon as possible, as Jimmy was dying and wanted to see me. During the last week of his life, David and I took turns sitting up with Jimmy during the night. Sometimes he would talk about old friends, sometimes about the play he was working on. He needed to get well so it could be finished. And there was the book he had started on Medgar, Malcolm, and Martin. He asked me to sort and file the papers in his study. After his death, I would combine all his papers in his New York office. Jimmy's funeral was at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York. Amiri Baraka reminded the congregation that the man whose life they were celebrating had lived that life as a witness, that he was God's black revolutionary mouth. Jimmy was buried at Fernwood Cemetery on Ardsley on Hudson, near Malcolm X and Paul Robeson, other witnesses. Meanwhile, I was awarded a Schomburg Fellowship and a Knopf contract for the biography. I continued to interview Jimmy's friends in New York, Istanbul, California, Paris, and St. Paul de Vence. There was, however, an element that increasingly I felt I needed to explore more fully. I remembered asking Jimmy what aspect of his career was most important to him. Without hesitation, he'd answered, "I'm a novelist." Following that lead, I decided that the biography could be anchored by his fictional work, that the fiction could reveal things that even the facts discovered in letters and interviews could not. This would be a literary biography. In Istanbul, Jimmy had often called me into his room to discuss the motives and curious actions of Leo Proudhammer, Black Christopher, and other characters in Tell Me How Long the Train's Been Gone. Baldwin's fiction always had a definite and clearly visible autobiographical base, and the characters in the fiction were driven by factors that sometimes surprised even their creator. This suggested to me that Jimmy's fiction could be as useful to me as a biographer as dreams could be to a psychoanalyst. I might find the unmasked Jimmy in his novels. Baldwin's first novel, Go Tell It on the Mountain, for instance, looks back on actual events in the author's early life. His adolescent sexual awakening, his salvation experience in his church, his struggle with his father, but it also provides metaphors for what would become a central Baldwin theme: that private love, the sexual life, the sexual love between individuals could not be separated from public love between peoples. In a vision during his almost orgiastic salvation experience at the church, the novel's hero, John Grimes, experiences a public kind of love, reliving the tragic history of African Americans. And as he leaves the church, he feels another kind of love for the boy Elisha, the church piano player. In effect, John Grimes' experience here is also James Baldwin's. The two kinds of love, public and private, lead them both not back to the church, but to a future indicated by the words John Grimes utters after Elisha's holy kiss on his forehead. I'm ready, I'm coming, I'm on my way. Giovanni's Room, Baldwin's second novel, reflects Baldwin's early years in Paris, his friendship with several women, his closeness to the gay bar scene, his relationship with the lover who locked him in a real Giovanni's Room. But Giovanni's Room developed into something other than what he had originally intended it. It became a metaphor for a belief that dominated the rest of Baldwin's life. The novel was not so much about homosexuality as about the cost of denying love, either public or private. In the novel, young David, who is in love with Giovanni, nevertheless leaves him for a loveless but safe relationship with a woman. Giovanni, echoing his creator, associates David's private betrayal with the public betrayal on the part of Americans in general. Americans, he says, do not understand love and its painful demands. In The Fire Next Time, Baldwin would agree with Giovanni and would call on Americans to change, to accept the difficult public love needed to overcome racism. The relatively conscious whites and the relatively conscious blacks, he would write in The Fire Next Time, must, like lovers, insist on or create the consciousness of the others. Baldwin's pursuit of love and his response to his prophetic vocation as a public lover continued to develop in the novel Another Country, based on the time spent in Greenwich Village after the first Paris years. The novel's plot stands against the background of the suicide of a friend whom Baldwin loved and whom in the novel becomes the jazz musician Rufus Scott, a man whose suicide makes him for Baldwin a symbol of the failure of love in America, personal and public. As in dreams, all the characters in another country are projections of aspects of their author. Some males, some female, some white, some black, some creative artists, some not. In their sexual interrelationships, they all attempt to break through conventional barriers to find love that will overcome their differences. But each relationship is challenged by the memory of Rufus, the black corpse floating on the national psyche. The lovers of another country are the relatively conscious blacks and whites who, like Baldwin, come to understand that love is a battle, love is a growing up, but who may or may not grow up fast enough to avoid the fire next time. In the last three novels, the central figures represent Baldwin's desperate hope that the lovers will prevail. If Beale Street Could Talk is a Black Lives Matter tale of black imprisonment confronted by love. Tell Me How Long the Train's Been Gone and the last novel, Just Above My Head, are thinly veiled autobiographical descriptions of Baldwin's midlife disillusionment. These novels provided me with insight to a side of James Baldwin, whose public life as prophet and artist made a successful private life close to impossible. You become famous because you're lonely, he wrote, and more lonely when you're famous. The actual writing of the biography took place after Baldwin's passing. Using what I had discovered in the letters, the journals, the interviews, the essays, the short fiction, and perhaps especially the novels, and my personal association with him, I felt I was ready to answer the question that had led me to the biography. What was Jimmy Baldwin really like? As I was researching the biography, I came across several comments Jimmy had made about love. In The Fire Next Time, for instance, he had written, "Love takes off the masks that we cannot live without, and no, we can't live within. Love here not only in the personal sense, but as a state of being or a state of grace. Not in the infantile American sense of being made happy, but in the tough and universal sense of a quest and daring and growth." Later, about Buford Delaney, he would say, "Art can only result from love, and no greater lover has ever held a brush." It became clear to me in my search for Jimmy that he was himself not only a prophet for his time, but one of its greatest lovers. Mm.